Okay, so if your Bible's handy, it's going to start in Numbers 4:21. And just to survey through here, we can see again that there's a reiteration of the Levitical duties. And it very specifically assigns the clans of Merari. We've already had a detailed list of the Kohathites' responsibilities. So there's going to be Gershon, there's going to be Merari, and we see that both Merari and Gershon receive wagons to carry the I don't want to say the furniture, but the construction elements of the Mishkan. Now we know the Kohathites cannot have a wagon, because remember, they carry the most holy objects, so those objects have to be carried on their shoulders. They can never be loaded into a wagon or an ox cart, which is, of course, something they did later in the time of King David, came to a bad end. So there's detailed instructions about the carrying of the Mishkan. And at the very beginning, where we're getting the name of the Torah portion, which is Naso, and Naso means to lift up. Now in context, it means a census. How does that relate to counting heads? In this case, which the wording there is a little bit different than the normal words that you would use for counting or taking a census, because there's other places in scripture where they're told to take a census. That's not the word that's used here. This word is naso, which means to lift up, in this case, to lift up the head. And that's going to mean something specific. When it's unique like that, when a word changes from what its customary use would be, then we pay attention. So the point here of naso, to lift up the head, it's going to have a special relevance to how those heads are lifted up. And it's not going to be a matter of pride, which is the danger of a census. The customary danger of taking a census is, in the case of many countries, they'll take a census in order to know if they have the personnel to make war. They'll take a census to know if they have the personnel to conscript labor into a large building project at this time. And so the purpose here is for a holy purpose, and the point of the counting is not the same. The point of this counting is not for your face to disappear into a number, but instead for your face to have significance as it is counted, as represented by the head itself. And that's something to remember. When you have a king, when you have a dictator, when you have a leader who's trying to take control of a large number of people, then often what happens is the individual is squashed. You lose your identity as an individual. We can see an example of this in the Holocaust. In the camps, people ceased to be people and faces, they merely became numbers. Were referred to as numbers. And so we need to beware when we're entering into a situation when we're nothing more than a number and there's no individual value. The individual loses its place by losing its face. Okay, from there, again, the counting goes on with the clans here. And then in chapter 5, oddly, what's inserted is here, it says, okay, you've got all these instructions about leprosy, about salat. Get rid of those people. Send them outside the camp. You know, after all the detailed information we had in Vayikra, look for this, look for that, don't do this, don't do that. You know, here's the way you do it, this is the way you don't do it, this is the color it is, this is how it appears. And then all of a sudden, just it seems like almost at random, we're going through the technical procedures for carrying the construction of the tabernacle. And all of a sudden, he's like, okay, send the lepers out. Send them to the outside of the camp. And anybody who's impure by a corpse. And so he reiterates at that point that the camp is pure. It's a place where he's going to dwell. And you have to kind of pick up on the subtlety there, because the leper is going to go completely outside the camp. But the one who has an emission, or who has become impure by a corpse, is sent away from the regions of the Levitical camp, which is inside. If you think of the layers of the camp, that would be the camp that they would be sent away from. And then, and this is the section that we're going to focus on tonight, in verse 5, it speaks about a person who commits a trespass. And there's going to be two kinds of trespass. There's going to be a trespass against another human being, where you rob, where you steal, where you take something that is his or hers. And so in that trespass, there's certain things that have to be done in order for it to be served. The main thing is it's going to have to be restored, the full amount. The principal, or that is called the head amount, by the way. The head amount is restored, and you add a fifth part to it as a penalty for taking the item. And then inserted in there is going to be a reference about somebody who takes something that's consecrated for holy purpose. For instance, maybe you went into your neighbor's house and your neighbor stepped out for a minute and ate an apple. It was in this nice big basket of apples. So you were convinced that that's what those apples were there for. So you just helped yourself to an apple out of the basket. What you didn't know is that basket of apples was designated for them to take as first fruits at Sukkot. That was their Sukkot basket, and you ate out of it. And it had already been dedicated to the temple. And so now you have robbed God, and you've robbed your neighbor. Not really robbed, you've stolen from. You've stolen from. Robbery has more of a violent connotation. It wasn't a violent thing at all. It was just an accident. You didn't know. It didn't have anything special on it, and you made a mistake. And so, again, that has to be rectified. Now, right on the heels of that come the trial of the sotah. The trial of the sotah is the trial of the woman accused of adultery. It says, when a spirit of jealousy comes upon her husband. And there's a particular condition that applies to that. Now, of course, if he wants to give her a divorce and send her away, if she requests a divorce and wants to go away, those things can happen before we get to this point. But at this point, apparently she's maintaining her innocence. And so we have this whole trial where she brings in a particular offering. Her hair is uncovered and allowed to go loose or wild. And there are certain scriptures that are written on a parchment, including the sacred name, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And those are washed off in water and dust from the floor of the tabernacle, and then the woman has to drink it. And then basically, if she's guilty, it says her belly and her thigh will fall. And if she's innocent, then she's going to bear children. And there was a danger of this particular trial ending up as a fertility clinic. We don't think about that, but in that day and time, there was a horrible stigma associated with not being able to bear children. And so there are traditions, there are stories in the tradition about certain women in scripture, like Hannah or King David's mother, who wanted to bear children and they couldn't, and so they threatened to put themselves through the trial of the sotah, to seclude themselves with a man, but to maintain their purity, but to provoke their husbands to jealousy so that they would bring them into the Mishkan and accuse them of adultery so that they could go through the trial knowing they were innocent and then bear children, which would have been a pretty complicated way to turn it into a fertility clinic, but the danger was there. And so there's not much in the way of the tradition where people took advantage of that. We just have a couple of examples. The reason being that it was such a humiliating ordeal that nobody would want to go through that. And then we know that when we get to the book of Revelation, it is a trial of the sotah. There is a woman accused. There's two women in Revelation, and the details that we read about right here in this Torah portion, Naso, you will reread in the book of Revelation as it concerns Israel. And then you'll see two manifestations of Israel. You'll see the accused woman who's committed harlotry, riding the scarlet beast, and then you'll see Israel, the virtuous woman, and the testimony to her purity is going to be her children keep the commandments of God and the testimony of Yeshua. So every detail here, it's important for you to learn that trial. It's also important to learn that trial because of its relevance to the dragon. And if that doesn't make much sense to you right now, then if you'll remind me, those of you in tomorrow's class, if you'll remind me before I turn the recording off, I'll grab workbook 2 and I'll go over that section out of workbook 2 so that you can see how that plays out in the book of Revelation. Let's see. And that goes on for quite a while. That takes up some real estate there. And then in chapter 6, we have the Nazirite vow. And what a jumble of topics here. And there's specific prescriptions here for the Nazirite vow, what the Nazirite can eat, what he cannot eat, what he can drink, what he cannot drink, how he treats his hair, his consecrated hair, what happens if he makes a mistake. Remember, he can't go into a corpse, he can't mourn even for close relatives. If he makes a mistake, how he has to reset on the 7th and the 8th days. It prescribes the different types of offerings, which we will go over. Those are important. It's important for you to know what those offerings of the Nazir or the Nazirite are and what they represent. And I think if we unpack that, then it's going to help us pick up all these threads and how they're related to one another, where they're not such a seemingly random jumble of topics. So we won't go into minute detail, but we'll go into detail. And if you've never learned the names of the different offerings, this is a good chance to either learn them, and if you already know them, it's a good chance to review them. Because if you know what each is for, then you'll know a good context for what's happening. And then it ends up with that most wonderful of passages, the Aaronic benediction. It's the way of placing the sacred name upon the children of Israel and blessing them. So as you can see, it's not so much ground to cover, it's lots of different topics to tie together. And that's what we're going to try to do in 2 days. We'll see how it goes. So let me share the screen with you. Oh, and I never did tell you what the condition was for the trial of the sotah. The trial of the sotah took place on the condition that the husband had previously with the wife not to seclude herself with this particular individual. And as we take that again to the book of Revelation, where we know the woman is riding the scarlet beast and all the idolatry that's involved in that act and what it represents, we can see from Genesis to Revelation, Israel has been warned about a certain individual, not to seclude herself with him, to avoid him. And time after time, when she's apostate, Israel has teamed up with that particular individual. And so that's important to know that it's not without warning, it's not random, it's not out of the blue. The assumption is that by the time the woman makes it to the trial, that she has been warned, not just in general, but specifically about this particular individual. So for the ones listening on the recording, our Torah portion scriptures are Numbers 4:21 through 7:89, Judges 13:2 through 13:25, Psalm 67, and then two specific passages out of the Brit Chadashah, Matthew 11:11 through 19, which I think is going to come the closest to hitting upon the theme of the Nazirite, and then Acts 21:17 through 26, where you can see another practical application of the Nazirite and what those individuals might be trying to accomplish by taking a Nazirite vow. Okay, what we have here is an ancient bronze razor. And the ancient razors could be made out of, what is it called? Obsidian. I think it's a sharp rock, bronze, and there was another material. It could have been iron, but that would have been, getting into the Iron Age. But the oldest examples are like this bronze one. And they were in this kind of curved shape, which I would assume would make them easier to sharpen. I'm not sure. But that's interesting that they were in that. I always think of a straight razor when I think of old razor blades for shaving. But the Nazirite had to be able to shave his or her. Remember, either male or female can take the Nazirite vow. So they had to be able to shave their heads once the period of the vow was over. And so it would be an implement similar to this, where they would, in that temple area, once the offerings had been accepted on their behalf, and the offerings were extensive and expensive, once they were accepted, then the individual would shave the hair with some sort of razor and collect the hair, and then the hair is not going to go on the altar. The hair is going to go into the fire where they cook certain sacrifice pieces that the priest is required to eat. And so that would be the process here. So let's go back to that basic passage from Numbers 5:5 and try to get a handle on what a trespass is, because it's going to apply to the Nazirite, it's going to apply to the woman accused of adultery, it's going to apply to someone who takes the holy things unwittingly, or even through robbery. Even if you did it on purpose, it still has to be restored and added to. So it says, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel, when a man or woman commits any of the sins of mankind, acting unfaithfully against the Lord. All right there, you can stop and say, oh, wait a minute. If I commit a sin of mankind, I'm acting unfaithfully against the Lord. Because it doesn't just include taking something that is his, it includes taking something that belongs to someone else. So it can go vertically, it can go horizontally. Either way, when you trespass against him and his commandments, or against someone else's person or property, both are acts of unfaithfulness against the Lord. And he says, and that person is guilty, then he shall confess his sins which he has committed, and he shall make restitution in full for his wrong, and add to it 1/5 of it, and give it to him whom he has wronged. But if the man has no relative to whom restitution may be made for the wrong, the restitution which is made for the wrong must go to the Lord for the priest, besides the ram of atonement, by which atonement is made for him. Now let's unpack that a little bit. Let's say that you took something from someone, and it could have been willingly, it could have been unwillingly. The person dies before you can restore what you have taken. If so, then you give that repayment to his closest relative. And the rabbis read into this a special consideration to the stranger and the alien who resides with the Israelite, because those people in general had no relative who could be repaid. Because remember, they're from an outside nation. And so when somebody comes into the nation and is in some stage of the process of attaching themselves to Israel, if you wrong that person, and see, it was very tempting to wrong those people because they had no relatives that were going to take any vengeance upon you. They were very vulnerable. And so you have to read into this an adjustment here for vulnerability, so that you're not tempted to mistreat the stranger. Or in modern Judaism, it would be the convert. At any rate, if there's nobody that you can repay, plus the 1/5 penalty, then you have to give that amount of money or that lamb or whatever it is. Most likely going to be money. There's going to be a valuation that's placed upon the object, and that's how you add 1/5 of the value. And the court assesses the value. So if the person is dead and there's nobody you can give it to, you still have to repay it. It's just that you're going to take that same amount and you're going to pay it to the priest, besides what you're going to have to do with the ram of atonement. So you also have things to pay into the tabernacle itself. Because of the transgression, you don't just repay the person you wronged, the acknowledgement, and he tells us up here at the beginning, acting unfaithfully against the Lord. You've also acted unfaithfully against the one that the person has served. And so you bring this ram of atonement in addition to, and you're going to see there's going to be other things that you have to bring in. But it becomes very expensive, by the way, to steal something. But it says also, every contribution pertaining to the holy gifts of the sons of Israel, which they offer to the priest, shall be his. Now remember, there's certain things that you can set aside as gifts or offerings, whether voluntary or commanded, obligatory. Those contributions are set aside as holy. They're designated. Remember, there's certain animals, you can't substitute an animal for that. And if you're not going to bring that animal in, then it says you have to break it. You profit from it because it's not yours. It belongs to a higher realm. And so inserted within this where you've wronged a specific individual, he says, now for the same reason that you would also bring a ram of atonement to the tabernacle if you stole from a human being, if you steal one of the holy gifts, it's something that belongs to Adonai. It's consecrated to him. You also have to repay the price. And how do you repay it? You're going to pay that extra amount to the priest. And it says, so every man's holy gift shall be his. Whatever any man gives to the priest, it becomes his. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, if any man's wife goes astray and is unfaithful to him, and then it moves on. And then we get these long details about the trial of the Sotah, the woman accused. What I wanted you to see by capturing this section here is how it goes from taking from another person, taking from the holy things which are dedicated to the tabernacle, and taking from the marriage relationship. Those three things are one topic. There's no, and Moses got up on a different day and decided to expound a new topic. That's not what happens. Moses simply goes in, then the Lord spoke to Moses saying, here's the topic. Now I want you to address if a man's wife goes astray and is unfaithful. And you can see, if you just look at the bold print there, how it begins with acting unfaithfully against the Lord when you commit a sin against another person, and then compare that to the woman accused. If any man's wife goes astray and is unfaithful. What ties those two things together is unfaithfulness, trespass. Taking something that's consecrated for a higher use. It belongs, it's the property of a higher realm, and we're not entitled to it. So when we look at the trial of the Sotah, there's so many layers to this particular passage of the Torah. Like I said, in workbook 2, we go through it as an application in the book of Revelation, as Israel being the woman accused. But there's also lots of other ways of looking at the trial. Just like there's lots of ways of looking at the Nazir. And sometimes if you get a bunch of people like us together, we might go through one explanation of a particular passage, and somebody says, oh, but have you heard the teaching that so-and-so did? And someone said, oh, but so-and-so did a teaching on that too. And they said, and what you realize is a really beautiful thing, that there's so many different ways of finding meaning in a passage of the Torah, and they're not all the same. So you're not ever going to get bored. Every year as you go through it, you're going to pick up, what does it say, treasures new and old. So we want to look at a different layer of this treasure. And remember, the condition was when this woman is put on trial, it's concerning a particular man with whom she secluded herself. And nobody knows exactly what happened. It could have been nothing. It could have been everything. And we just saw how that contextually, the Sotah follows the instructions of restitution for theft and the trespass offerings that are given to the priest specifically. And there can be an occasion, just like the example with the apples. You didn't know the apple was consecrated for a first fruits offering, and by mistake you ate it. You ate a holy thing that didn't belong to you. And not only did it not belong to you, it didn't even belong to the earthly realm. It was devoted to a higher realm. And so you had to not only restore the value of the apple, whatever the value of the apple was, you had to add a fifth. And I would give you a math example, but I don't do math. So the positioning here of the sotah to the trespass offering takes us back to an old hermeneutical principle of smichut, or placement, how things are arranged on the real estate of the parchment. Because remember, you only have a limited amount of parchment, and the more you can pack into that one space, the more opportunities we have to sit around and say, you know what, I heard a teaching on this that went this way. You know, I heard a teaching on this that went that way. You know, when I read it, what I saw was this. That's what smichut opens up. More connections for us to make and to learn more. There's no point in looking at a passage of the Torah and saying, this is the only thing meaningful about it. Just prepare yourself. You will continue to find meaning in that passage as long as you live and beyond your life. You know, when Yeshua starts teaching, we're going to realize we've not even been scratching the surface here. The smichut, though, draws the attention of the sages, because if it were arranged topically, then logically you would expect to find it in the portion of Acharei Mot, which gives a list of prohibited unions. And so an adulteress would belong in the category of a prohibited union. Nevertheless, she finds her way into a list of transgressions that seem to refer more to property and objects, not to relationships. But when we see the role of priesthood to the layperson and the layperson to the priesthood, then it makes sense that the layperson in this most serious of questions, which is that a question of marriage, he resorts to the priest and the priestly service to settle the question. Because every earthly marriage that is a holy matrimony, that is a true covenant, is a symbol and a picture and a living out of a principle of the higher holy relationship of marriage, that of our relationship to heaven. And so in this, you know, even if people aren't Jewish, they tend to want clergy to conduct the service, to make sure that they're touching that realm of the heavenly, that they're dedicating their marriage for a heavenly purpose. It's not just to serve the purpose of mating and reproduction like an animal. That can be done without a marriage. That can be done without clergy. But when you see your marriage as part of a heavenly commandment, as part of a relationship to that which is higher and holier, then you want to involve the priestly service in that marriage, both in the marriage and when there is suspicion that the marriage has been violated, that somebody has stolen something from another person that was not just a regular object. It wasn't just any old apple. It wasn't just any old woman. That came out wrong. But it was somebody or something that was holy to a heavenly purpose. And so in Malachi 2:7, it says, for the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek the Torah at his mouth, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. So here would be the danger. Let's think of our current situation. I haven't had time to watch the news earlier today, so when I came in this evening, I turned on the news right quick while I ate supper, and I see all these protests, and they're talking about this group called Antifa or something, Antifa. And basically they want anarchy, is what they're saying. They want no structure. And so in the United States, at least today, there's already an element of that. We tend to reject structure and to prize individuality. And now we see how, also in the Torah portion, it discusses the bringing of the gifts from the 12 tribes. I don't know if I saw that in the right place. At any rate, this is part of this narrative, the bringing of the holy gifts to the Mishkan of the 12 tribes. And so the tribes are bringing these things for the priestly service. It's all tied together. Now, if you as an Israelite severed those ties, then you're severing yourself, based on what Malachi is saying, from the teaching of the Torah. You are severing yourself as well from the fellowship of the Torah. And it demonstrates a lack of gratefulness for the opportunities that were provided, this example being out here in the wilderness. Now you have a Mishkan, now you have a priesthood, you have a work cadre of Levites. They've appointed judges. You're camped according to your tribe and your clan. You have all these opportunities through the organization to be grateful that it's not anarchy and that everybody isn't out there doing his or her own thing, because we all know that if we give 1 million people a copy of the Torah and have them write up what they think a particular commandment is supposed to look like and how it's supposed to be done, we'll probably get 1 million different answers. But we don't have to rely on 1 million different answers to know what to do. Instead, he has centralized it. He's saying there should be a core structure in place that will organize things. And so you can seek that out. And what's that going to do? It's going to maintain your fellowship with one another. And if you're not grateful for that structure that's in place for you, or you can resort to that structure to learn the Torah, to know how to apply it in a specific situation, then the sages say that the way that it's set up, if the man has departed and is no longer learning the Torah, he has been departing from the Torah. He has appointed himself as the own priest of his household, apart from that structure that's put in place for him, then his family is highly likely to go into a spiritual decline, and he may not be aware of it. But they say the moral condition of his family will eventually fall because he severed his ties to his spiritual community. And it still happens anyway. Even when we cling to a holy community and we do everything right, children and spouses still go astray. It could still happen. But when you separate and isolate yourself, the odds increase because there's nothing to hold on to in a time of crisis. And if you think about it, people who never go to church, or they never go to a congregation, or they never go to a synagogue, when a really significant life event occurs, where do they go? If they've been once in the last 10 years, they will still go back and ask the preacher. They'll still go back and ask the rabbi. they'll look for something that has structure in a time of crisis, when they want to be married, when they need somebody to perform a funeral. At those most critical moments, unfortunately, it finally dawns on them that it's not good to be an island unto yourself, because there's certain rituals of life and death for which the priest was appointed, for which there should be a structure in place. And it's not there to be used only in those moments of crisis, but to be cultivated in the in-betweens. And so they say, for this man who has departed from the Torah and just decided to stay home and do it his way, to study the Torah for himself, apart from anyone else, any oversight, any structure, any accountability for what he thinks he's reading in it, then he's really insulting the Spirit of grace. Because it's through grace that the Holy One gives us these structures that can bring order, that can bring peace in those, not just those moments of crisis, but in our everyday. So by insulting such a graceful gift, they say that ultimately he is the one who will be insulted, because his family will fall into decay, the wife being suspected of infidelity being one of those signs, because he has not been grateful. So where was this fifth established? Ironically, it's even established in Egypt, of all places. We can go back to Genesis, and in Genesis 31:34, it says, let Pharaoh take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let him exact a fifth of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance. So this fifth part, it would be chamishi in Hebrew, which means 5. So if you say chamishi, you're saying the fifth. The fifth becomes a signal for a holy portion. And then in Genesis 47:24, it says, at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own for seed of the field, and for your food, and for those of your household, and as food for your little ones. And then in verse 26, it says, Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, valid to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. Only the land of the priests did not become the Pharaoh's. So you see there that association of Pharaoh taking a fifth, and in return, he leaves the land of the priests in their own hands. And so when you see the fifth, you can say, I might be reading about something that concerns a holy portion. Even when we're in an unholy place like Egypt, it might still signal a priest's portion. So if we want to understand this holy status between Israel and the priesthood, that's easy. We just came out of the book of Vayikra that established point after point after point in which Israel has to depend upon its priesthood for sacrifice, for praise and worship. And again, going back to those life events, the cycles of the Moedim and so forth. Even relying on the priest, let's say there's a murder that's committed out in the field, and it's between this city and that city, and nobody knows who killed the person. But there still has to be acknowledgement that the person was killed. There still has to be justice. And so they measure the distance. You have to bring the priesthood into the equation. Bring the elders into the occasion. You have to have structures in place, order in place to maintain holiness, not just in the Mishkan, but remember, that odd little thing that was stuck in there about send the lepers out of the camp, because he says, I dwell in the camp. And then send those who are unclean out of the Levitical camp, because I dwell in that camp. And so these structures are in place to invite the divine presence to remain with us. And so we really get the status between Israel and the priesthood pretty easy. We can understand the holy status between a husband and wife pretty easy. But how in the world are we going to fit the Nazir, the Nazirite, into that context? Because remember, the Nazirite, he cannot eat grapes. He can't eat grape products. He can't eat anything soaked in grape juice. And he cannot drink its juice in any form, fresh or alcoholic. The Nazirite can't attend a funeral, even for the closest relative. And if you compare that to the high priest, or either of those to the high priest, see the priesthood, they cannot consume alcohol when they're conducting their services. Now, outside the temple, when they're not on duty, they can drink alcohol. The Nazirite can't at all, not even touch any product remotely related to a grape. A high priest can only mourn and attend funerals for his very, 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 very close relative. But a Nazirite can't attend any funeral. He can't even be in a building, a tent where there's a dead person. And so this is a prohibition that's even more severe than the high priest. And then, remember the priesthood, they can't let their hair grow wild. And just by custom, the priesthood cut their hair about every 30 days. That's just a little bit of trivia. So about every 30 days, they got a haircut. But it's less about the length of the hair than how the hair appears. Does it appear unkempt? Does it appear wild? The priest does have to have ordered hair. The Nazirite must grow long hair. And he or she cannot cut it until the full vow is paid. Because the hair, once the vow is made, until it is paid, the hair is holy. And then ultimately that hair is going to be burned up. When that vow is paid, it's going to include a sin offering, which is the puzzle for us to work out. Why would the Nazirite paying a vow include a sin offering? And here's what Numbers 6, 7 through 8 says. For the crown of his God is upon his head. All the days of his status as a Nazir, he is holy to Hashem. And I should have put that's your mark scroll. But his hair is seen as his crown. And the crown isn't really his. The hair that grows during this period belongs to Adonai. That's why he can't cut it. He can't style it. It's not his. It's his to protect through his actions, through staying away from a corpse, through staying away from alcohol, grape products, fresh grapes. That consecrated hair brings on him a severity in his life because he can't have the wine or the grape products at any time. All right? If you think of Shabbat, we consecrate, part of the consecration of Shabbat is drinking a cup of Kiddush wine. And so if you are accustomed to having a cup of grape juice or a cup of wine for Shabbat every single Shabbat and every single feast, except Yom Kippur. Imagine, okay, now you can't participate in Kiddush, which is the big deal, the consecration of Shabbat. He can't cut his hair, and he can't mourn those close relatives. Now, if we take those conditions of severity, we can see that the Nazir is on a higher level of discipline than even the high priest. And you can see the potential here for a lot of psychological processes to happen within the thinking of the Nazir. So the potential is there as that hair grows, as the crown of Adonai grows on his head, that it has the potential at the same time both to impose a severity on his life, but also a shining glory upon his life. Okay, the hair is also involved in the trial of the Sotah. Remember we said, I don't know how long ago it was, one of our lessons about the hair and Esau being the representation of wild hair. And when a person has wild hair, it's an indication that his inner spiritual life is disheveled. Things are not in order. He's a little bit scatterbrained when it comes to his walk of faith. And so in Numbers 5:18, it says, the priest shall then have the woman stand before the Lord and let the hair of the woman's head go loose. So what does this signal to those who are watching? She is suspected of having a loose spiritual life, a disheveled spiritual life, because her fidelity to her husband is in question. For her also, her hair is a symbol of glory and a symbol of holiness. Her hair is consecrated to her husband. And we can look at the Nazir to help us understand why these things are related. The Nazir's hair belongs to his or her husband above. So when we look at the trial of the Sotah, in the natural realm, we look at her hair and say, you know what? Her whole body, and especially her glory, her hair, is consecrated to her earthly husband. He's the only one who has the right to touch her hair. If another man touches her hair, then symbolically, he has stolen a consecrated holy thing. Just like the Nazirite's hair is consecrated to heaven, so a wife's hair is consecrated to her husband. Why? Because they have joined in a holy purpose, into a holy covenant to serve the husband above. And so the hair in that sense becomes a holy thing. It's dedicated to a higher heavenly purpose. It signifies a covenant life. It signifies obedience to the Torah. The same way with the Nazir. When you see the Nazir with his long hair, you know that he's taken a vow. And in that vow, he was following the instructions of the Torah very carefully, because if you mess them up, you have to reset. You can't deduct the days until you messed up. You have to start over with the reset. And so you're very careful, you're very thoughtful as a Nazir. You think about everything you put in your mouth, either food or drink, because you have to know when you put that thing in your mouth, whether it has a drop of grape juice or if that food has a tiny piece of a grape within it. And if you just pop things in your mouth without thinking, you're liable to make a mistake. Especially in ancient world, even today in Israel, in the Middle East, you find a lot of dishes that are prepared with raisins, because that's the way that grapes could be preserved. And it added an element of sweetness where, you know, they don't have sugar cane available on store shelves. How do you sweeten things? You sweeten them with fruit. And so having raisins on hand was just a given. And so you had to be really careful in that respect. That's even more restrictive than just eating a kosher diet. And if you've ever tried to incorporate a different diet into your kosher diet, and many people do for health reasons, they might be vegan, they might be vegetarian, they might be pescatarian, they might be gluten-free, they might be dairy-free. There's all sorts of diets out there. And if you've ever had to try to merge one of those special diets with your kosher diet, you know how much harder it is to prepare a meal, because you have to think about every product that goes into the meal. And so this is such an intense place of consecration and holiness. Again, the hair representing the glory of heaven. And it's glory for the sake of heaven. In each case, it's not just that the woman's hair is for the sake of her husband alone. The glory in her hair is for the sake of heaven as well. The same thing with the Nazir. He's not just growing his long hair to have long hair and say, look at me, I'm righteous. I've taken a vow, a very expensive vow, so I must be rich in order to make this vow. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, I'm consecrating my hair, I'm consecrating my head to heaven. And for the duration that this hair grows, my hair is not my own. I might be wearing my hair, but it's not mine. I'm not isolated. I'm not a person unto myself. I'm not a person apart from the priesthood. Because see, when the husband who suspects the woman of adultery wants to solve the problem, now he must go to the priest. And if that's the reason that his house has fallen into disarray because he has absented himself from the priest or from the holy services, now he is forced to go back and seek the priest's help. Just like he says, you shall seek knowledge from the lips of the priest. Now he's going to have to go back. He must have the priest's assistance. In the case of the Nazir, he can't really take on his vow all by himself. When that vow is complete, then he must go back to the priest, because only the priest can eat certain portions of those sacrifices that he has to pay. You could bring the sacrifices, but without the priest, who would eat the foreleg? And see, where they cooked those pieces that the priest had to eat, that's the fire that the hair went into, not the altar. So what do we see in common here? Everything is going back to the priest. Everything is going back to a structure. And that structure is keeping relationships within Israel, relationships within the body of Messiah in balance, in a state of holiness, maintaining holiness. When it has not been maintained in holiness, it provides the pathway back. And in each instance, it's telling you that there is a thread holding you to that priestly service. That when the temple is destroyed, there is a very unpleasant disconnectedness. And we've all experienced that. which that would probably be a good place to stop right there. But we've experienced that as we've moved back into the Torah, and we're seeking that wisdom and we're seeking that knowledge. Most of us have not had a competent individual that we could resort to on a daily basis. We were kind of out there by ourselves, not by choice, but by necessity, because there was no temple. There is no priesthood. I mean, there is. They know who they are for the most part, but there's no temple in which they can function. They have a few extra privileges in a synagogue, but for the most part, the things that we're reading about, we can't do because the structure has been removed. And it hasn't been there for most of history. It's just for brief moments in history that these holy structures and the holy priesthood has existed as that focal point. And so what do? We adjust. We find ways to mimic that structure. We have elders sometimes at congregations. We have pastors. We have rabbis. We have a Beit Din that still functions on certain things like marriages and so forth. But I think as I looked at the news tonight when I came in, and I could see it was a free-for-all. And the authority structures seem to have very little interaction other than negative. These were not the people that the crowds were going through for wisdom, if that makes sense. And see, these authority structures should be places we should look to where they do have wisdom. And like we saw with the ages of service, where they also have maturity, where they recognize that each individual is called to make those higher connections to holiness. Whether it's respecting someone's property, and that they can have property that is theirs and not mine, because it's within their hand to whom they consecrate that property in holiness. It's not mine to take. Whether it's the question of husband and wife, it's for the husband and the wife to negotiate their covenant marriage. The terms are in the ketubah, right? It's a covenant. And that marriage is consecrated for heavenly purpose, not for just reproducing, not just for gratifying one another in a sexual way, but to establish a relationship with heaven on earth. And what comes out of that should be godly children. And you see where the less structure that's in place, the more prone we are to being that isolated individual, kind of stuck out there and relying on ourselves for the most part to find our questions of everyday life. And I don't want to say everyday holiness, but every day is an opportunity for holiness. And we're doing the best we can. And so where we're going to take this tomorrow is finding the balance, because our tendency is going to become more isolated or to become too lax. And I think I've even put a PowerPoint on there for tomorrow that says some people spend their whole lives beating themselves up, and other people spend their whole lives beating up other people. We tend as human beings to want to do one or the other, right? With some of us, everything's my fault. And with some people, everything's somebody else's fault. But we have to find that balance. We have to know when to be strict with ourselves, and we have to know when to be gracious with ourselves, which is where we're going to bring in the Aaronic benediction and the bringing of the gifts of the 12 tribes, where the whole point was to lift up your head and understand you are an individual. You're not just a face and a number for a building project or for a census so that they'll know how many lanes to put on the interstate. See, we've all been just a number so many times. But the Father in heaven sees us as more than a number. He sees us as an individual, and we count as an individual. That's how it's different with Naso, as opposed to just counting how many men you have between this age and this age, so I know how many I can suit up in a war and how many I can afford to lose in a battle, which is faceless. But he says, every one of these people count to me. And then you can also see yourself as part of a group, a tribe. You have a tribe. It doesn't feel like it right now, but you have a tribe. And that's why in this same portion, it leads to each of the 12 tribes coming up, bringing their gifts of silver and gold. And it doesn't matter that they're all identical. Could he have said, this is the gift each one brought and been done with it? But that precious real estate of the Torah, he says, no, I'm going to count every single one and list them by name, because you're all important to me. Lift up their heads and let them know they're not just numbers. There's no sense in being isolated. That if we looked at his word, we are going to find ways of holy fellowship. Even in the times we have to set ourselves apart for additional consecration and self-discipline, there will be those times. But at the conclusion of those times, he drove them back to the priest. And so at the conclusion of this, he's going to find a way to pull us together. And we are not going to lose our identity with him and our relationship with him one bit. No matter how many millions upon millions he gathers together, he will still know us by name, by a new name actually. And when somebody gives you a new name, he knows you, because your name is what you are.